All right, this week, the last race from the November 2024 election cycle was finally settled 6 months after the fact. It was for a seat on the North Carolina State Supreme Court. It was a very tight race, but in the end, the incumbent, Democratic Justice Allison Riggs, beat her opponent, Republican State Appellate Judge Jefferson Griffin, by 734 votes. After 2 recounts and review and confirmation by the State Board of Elections, Judge Griffin sued to block the certification of Justice Riggs' victory and to invalidate 65,000 ballots. He cited incomplete voter registration data and absentee ballots submitted by overseas military personnel who didn't show ID, even though none of those voters violated election laws that were in place at the time that they cast their ballots. Remember that thing from Handmaid's Tale where those doctors were executed for stuff that they did before it was against the law to do the stuff that they did? It's kind of like what they were talking about in North Carolina. So last month, the North Carolina Court of Appeals ruled in Griffin's favor, and Riggs appealed that ruling. Then the North Carolina Supreme Court issued a split ruling, throwing out the largest of Griffin's challenges, but ruling that thousands of military and overseas voters would have to prove their eligibility within a 30-day ballot review process known as a cure period. Hundreds of other voters challenged over their residency status would have had their votes canceled altogether. So with that ruling, the Supreme Court essentially allowed election rules to be changed retroactively and opened a narrow path for this election to be overturned. One dissenting justice, Republican Richard Dietz, wrote in part that he expected that when the time came, our state courts surely would embrace the universally accepted principle that courts cannot change election outcomes by retroactively rewriting the law. I was wrong. By every measure, this is the most impactful election-related court decision our state has seen in decades, end quote. All right, so this case, we've covered it a few times on this show. This case continued to bounce between the courts. And earlier this week, a federal district judge appointed by Donald Trump ruled against the challenger, Judge Griffin, saying that he cannot, quote, change the rules of the game after it had been played, end quote. The decision, however, continued to leave room for Griffin to appeal that ruling. But on Wednesday, Judge Jefferson Griffin finally conceded defeat. Justice Allison Riggs released a statement saying, quote, after millions of dollars spent, more than 68,000 voters at risk of losing their votes, thousands of volunteers mobilized, hundreds of legal documents filed, and immeasurable damage done to our democracy, I'm glad the will of the voters was finally heard 6 months and 2 days after Election Day, end quote. Nonetheless, this is a cautionary tale of Republicans, or anybody really, trying to overturn an election result and retroactively change the rules to disqualify voters. It came dangerously close to succeeding, and it could offer a blueprint for future election challenges that fall before a yet more sympathetic court. Joining me now is Justice Allison Riggs, Supreme Court of North Carolina. Congratulations on having your own job back. What a thing. I mean, you and I have been talking about this for months. It is wild that this got as far as it did, this concept of ruling on an election based on new rules that were not in place when the ballots were cast.
That's right, Allie. Thank you for having me. And I think the most important takeaway here is that we cannot just act like all's well that ends well. We keep having these near misses on constitutional crises where people in power actually try and come so close to overturning the will of the voters. And I'm so grateful that in a thoughtful, well-reasoned decision, a federal judge said, whoa, vindicated the right of these voters to vote and said what we had said all along, that the federal Constitution does not allow the changing of election laws after an election in order to retroactively disenfranchise voters. What we saw here in North Carolina was my opponent targeting military voters only when they lived in 4 Democratic-leaning counties. This kind of strategic targeting, selective targeting, that then he invited our state courts to give the green light to, casting it in state action. It invites incredible mischief And I'm so grateful for the people who've stood by me for the last 6 months. I would be remiss in my obligations as a constitutional officer not to do everything I can to help people understand just how close we came to an incredibly anti-democratic result, and that we have to be vigilant going forward, because if we want to elect judges who will put the Constitution and their country above their party and personal political ambitions, then when we have judicial elections, we have to demand accountability.
Yeah, and you know, we are, generally speaking, as a country, looking at judges and saying, hey, thanks for standing up for democracy. But then we have these little outliers that a lot of people in the rest of the country, if you're in Washington State, you're thinking, why do I care about Allison Riggs in North Carolina? What have we learned from this? What do we need to do to safeguard our elections from further attempts to use sympathetic courts and judges? Because some of it's about judicial elections and some of it's about immigration these days. What do we do to safeguard this? This is always hard, because as a regular person, you don't know, how do I influence courts and judges?
That's right. So I live in a state where the Constitution demands that we hold elections for judges. They're not appointed. There's a trend nationally to a more heavily politicized judicial elections, partisan judicial elections. We live in a country that's so deeply polarized that elections keep getting tighter and tighter. And so we see what we saw in North Carolina this year in my race, what we saw in Georgia in the presidential race in 2020. Like, this is a new norm. And so I think what we have to do is be vigilant about every time that we have a tight election. We now have to be on the lookout for this kind of strategic targeting of voters who the targeter just perceives that they weren't his supporters. That's going to happen. So we have to be aware that it's going to happen. And then with judges, especially state court judges in the many states that elect judges, I'm part of this, we have to do a better job to help voters understand who these judges are, what their values are, and what it really looks like to uphold the Constitution and the rule of law. So here in North Carolina, we have a chance to take back our state Supreme Court in the 2028 election. We first have to reelect Justice Anita Earls in 2026, but then control of the court flips. And it's going to be my job, in addition to my work on the bench, to help voters understand what it looks like to have a judge who is a person of character and integrity and who understands what the rule of law is, versus someone who is just acting as a partisan actor. And when we give voters that information, I think voters are well prepared, or better prepared, to anticipate and deal with some of these attacks on democracy.
But we're going to have to take these judicial elections seriously, the same way you take a presidential election seriously. Justice Allison Riggs, I never thought you and I would ever talk, and then we talked a lot. And I'm kind of glad that we're not going to have the same reason to talk all that much in the future, but we'll find other reasons. Thank you for coming on the show. Thanks for making us smarter about an issue that's important to all of us across the country. Justice Allison Riggs, newly confirmed as reelected to the bench on the North Carolina Supreme Court.